we did for the California High-Speed Rail. We're going to talk a little bit about methodology, cultural landscape components. Of course, this all started out as an architectural survey. We were ready to go, got out into the field, realized, whoa, we've got some major agricultural and cultural landscape elements going on up here. So we realized we needed to bring on Vonn. So I'm going to let her introduce herself and tell you a little bit about herself, and then we'll move into methodologies.
Hi, I've been involved in cultural landscapes for more than I would care to admit. I started out as a civil engineer draftsman and studying environmental design up north at Berkeley, but I worked a lot in civil, and then I kind of morphed over to landscape. I came into ASLA when they had the historic subcommittee. They used to call it historic landscapes. It changed to cultural later. I was exposed to the greats, the founders of cultural landscapes: Robert Melnick, Kathy Gilbert, Noel Vernon, Patricia O'Donnell, and the great Charles Birnbaum. So I've maintained relationships with most of them and have worked almost exclusively in the field. I love land. Land as a California native, it was an honor to work on the high-speed rail, and so it was a thrill when Ione called and said, "We have a lot of vegetation up here, and I think it might be good if you took the next plane." So that's how we started on this project.
All right, and I am Katie DeBiase. I work for IS Architecture. I'm an historic preservation specialist. Yeah, this has been a 2-year project for me, working on the California High-Speed Rail, very, well-known and sometimes not so popular project, especially if you ask those residents we spoke to out in the field. But yeah, I've got a lot of experience with that, and of course using CEQA compliance here in this project, as well as many others. Historic surveys, this was a big one for me. So yeah, we had a lot of fun actually out in the field. I spent about 8 weeks up in the Central Valley doing this large scale survey. Vonn went with us several times out there to make sure we got all of these cultural landscape components assessed and evaluated. And yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about our methodology, what is a cultural landscape, and yeah, please feel free to type in any questions you may have, and we'll get to them hopefully throughout the presentation.
So the methodology on almost any project starts with an historical context, and that's just not that easy. Everybody kept saying, "Hurry with the context, hurry." Yes. I had to really get my head around a 7,000-acre 1878 rural agriculture landscape. I accessed the wonderful Fresno State archives and library. Fresno State is this. We have 2 great ag schools, Fresno State and Davis, and they're both over a century. And California is all about architecture. About agriculture, and it was amazing to study and research in that repository. They also have a separate viticulture library, and here we are. This started out as vineyards. Essentially for winery first, but then they very quickly went into raisins. This area is the raisin belt of California, was the raisin belt of California. The factory that processed raisins could compete with anything in Detroit. This is big time ag and big time raisins. So that was wonderful to learn about and learn about the grapes that they chose, the grapes that failed, but how all these people came in from disparate parts of the world and settled here and made their way here. So it's not just a California story, it's an American history story. This is the latter half of the 19th century. This is California settling itself after its statehood in 1850. It's Central Valley specific context, and so many associations with the railroad. Just as one statement, the railroad settled the West, okay? So they had power over everything, over land, over transpo, over ag, over water. it was pretty amazing. But how they detailed this one specific very early colony. This was the colony movement. And it wasn't those utopian religious types. This was pure ag, and they really fashioned an amazing, attractive model way of getting people to invest in it, live in it, and do their agriculture in it. So I could go on forever about, and the context does seem to go on forever, but it's truly amazing. This is an ancient inland sea, all of Central Valley, and consequently the alkaline, the salt factor was a major factor at one point in failure, where they had to learn from that. The University of California at Berkeley figures huge in this. They had ag experiment stations that were invented just for this reason. The Tulare was the first. And so it's just fascinating to know how they set this up from nothing, and how there was an immigrant union that was founded by the railroads. It had the who's who of everyone in Northern California. It had former governors on it, and they were determined to get people involved in this that were of kindred races. So they actually dispatched people to go to Scandinavia, Germany, and there was a German syndicate in San Francisco. Yes, it was racially based, but they got people from Sweden that would come over. I mean, consider someone coming from Sweden to the Central Valley, okay, and adapting to it. 118 in the summer, not a tree for miles. And how these people adapted and worked on the land and made it happen. It's really amazing. So I'll let Katie go from there.
So obviously we started with, giving you a little bit of background. What is a cultural landscape? We have, what the NPS says. There are 4 different types, as, Vonn could tell you. This one is more of the vernacular landscape, although it was platted and developed more as a business. It is the area that we're talking about that we surveyed is called the Washington Irrigated Colony. It's now currently known as the Washington Irrigated Colony Rural Historic Landscape for official reasons. But so as we're talking about this, here's a little bit of, as we were talking about the context of the Washington Irrigated Colony. The map on the left there kind of shows you its relationship. At the very top of that map is the city of Fresno. And then, so we're just about 8 miles south of there, approximately. But you can see the relationship between the other colonies, because this colony development was something that came up and was kind of flourishing in the whole Central Valley. This map on the left shows you the relationship between the Washington Irrigated Colony, which is on the bottom, with the adjacent Central California colony, which wasn't quite as successful
at all.
And then, of course, on the right is the actual plat map from 1878. The 2 men, A.T. Covell and Wendell Easton, they developed this plan to create this irrigated colony. That small township there, originally known as Covell, now it's known as Easton. There was actually never an official name change, but everyone in this area knows it as Easton now. Platted this out in 1878 as a business plan, a business model, more than it's obviously a secular thing. There were no religious ties for this colony. It was all based on agricultural business.
Let me just say something about the public land survey system. You see all those boxes? When you fly over anything west of the Mississippi, this is what you see. Mm-hmm. After the Hidalgo Treaty of 1848 that led to California statehood, the U.S., as it was east of the Mississippi, east of Appalachia, leapfrogged to the West Coast. And so they decided to survey the entire American continent, and this is the survey they came up with, the township and range. So this is modeled obviously off of all the township and range, and their parceling was generated out of this survey system. You could buy as little as 20 acres, or you could combine and bundle many other acres. So this is part of it. You see a little township on the map on the right, a little township on the left there. They had arterials, north, south, east, west arterials. They planned some of the arterials to have denser type parcels so that it would kind of allude to more of a village. They actually really tried. A lot of the, there wasn't much that preceded Washington Irrigated Colony, but the ones that even went after, they just plotted it out and said, go for it. These people actually did extensive, you know, how to do it, where to get this, we can supply that, you can get kit homes. They absolutely did everything they could to make it attractive to someone who was going to come and spend the rest of their life here.
All right, and so continuing with that, photo on the left is a historic photo of obviously field-dried grapes onto the wooden trays. This is kind of how it was done back in the early days of the Washington Irrigated Colony. Of course, like we said earlier, it is the raisin belt, or at least it was at the time. So this is them collecting, harvesting grapes and drying them out, getting them ready for shipment, because there was, like we said early on, a railroad did go through this Washington Irrigated Colony. So there were packing houses all along that railroad through this colony. The photo on the right is a historic drawing that actually, that farmstead, even though it doesn't quite look like that, is actually still extant. It's very similar. I believe I have a picture of it later in the presentation, but they did a lot of historic drawings of these farmsteads to really advertise, because like we said earlier, they went over to Scandinavia, they went to Germany, they went to all these European countries trying to advertise and bring in people to settle their colony. And what I'll talk about a little bit later is how interesting this business model, like I keep saying, this business model that Covell and Easton put together, it really actually did not incorporate any cultural traditions. When you go through and you're there in the Washington Irrigated Colony, you don't see anything that resembles Scandinavian architecture. You don't see anything that resembles any of those populations that actually came to settle. Covell and Easton set it up and basically said, here is everything you need. It's all laid out. Business plan is in check. You just come, you farm, and you live. And except
they had serious cheese, adobe cheese building, and dairy.
Yes,
I mean, that's what they had to have most of.
Right. All right.
This is the Detroit factory of raisins. This is in Fresno. And initially, the Central Pacific went through here, and all of the towns in Central Valley started as railroad stations. And the person of the four titans of the railroads, Leland Stanford, who was a governor of California very briefly, set those stations up, and he cited them in particular places, and for both transportation rationale, but for agriculture and for association with people who said, put it over here. Okay. So he laid all those out, and they hooked up to San Francisco. So really, when shipping was king, all this got put on flatbeds and taken up to the factory, and then they went out to San Francisco on rail and then on ships. So that's how it was. That before the Panama Canal. I mean, this is how it happened. So. Yes, we have a lot of guiding documents. I always use the Guide to Cultural Landscape Reports, which the National Park Service uses. I wish more landscape architects knew about this, because this is the real how to, line by line, how to do a context, how to evaluate a landscape, and how to do treatment of that landscape, how to assess integrity through the 7 aspects. So there's a lot of information out there to help you, a lot of information. So put it in your library.
All right. So obviously, you want to talk about this?
Yeah. When I first, first, this is interesting, because the colony had been assessed in 1991 or 2 by a wonderful historian, Karen Whitesey, and I think she's with Deems at the time. She did an assessment, and it was mostly architecturally based, but she had already declared it eligible for the National Register on all 4 criteria. We had all of her work to spin off of, which was brilliant. And but her period of significance added was from the founding, 1878 to 1910. I can't remember why she said 1910.
She said, I have it on here. She basically ended it at 1910, saying that the farming patterns were radically altered in the colony, returning to the late 19th century crops after this period. So there was kind of a shift in how they were doing things. So that was kind of how she determined that, okay, 1910 is a good place to stop.
That after much more research, and this was at the Viticulture and at Fresno State, and a little bit at the Bancroft. When we talk about California water wars, this is where it began. It was clear when you bought property, water rights came with it. That doesn't happen anymore. And when these colonies, we have another map, maybe 10, 12 years later, that the entire area is all colonies, and they're all irrigated from the Kings River or the San Joaquin River. Beautiful Sierra rivers they would advertise unlimited water. So when all this became a mania of privately owned water, Sacramento said, okay, hold on, we're going to do districts. So they did a law, I think in 1885, the Wright Act, which was amended about 20 times, and it really didn't go into effect until 1922 for this area. And that meant that they had to do surveys of everybody's canals, everybody's access, everybody's use. And that took several years. So finally, this colony, no longer autonomous in water rights, changed in 22. So I thought it better to say that was the closure of that autonomous colony movement. They were now on a grid, a water grid, as it were. So they still were using open furrow, ancient, evaporating, inefficient systems, but and they still do.
They still do.
And thank God there's more rain up there. But that's how the period of significance changed in our assessment. Sorry.
Yeah. No.
More guidelines.
Yes.
We also use the Rural Landscapes, NPS Bulletin, the guide, of course, and then how to apply National Register criteria. Let me tell you, almost all NPS publications address architecture and archaeology. It's really hard to extract evaluating methodology from, something that was written for a wood sash in a window. I mean, it's really hard. So you get a little bit more license there. You could say that the colony system now, it still has the open furrow canals. They're all in the same alignments. They all have some of the same access points. But we noticed, Katie and I noticed that when we were driving through there, it took a long time, each time, miles and miles of aisles. We noticed that there was a major infrastructural change to some of the canals, culverts and such, in the 40s. Now that would be a continuum, really, because all the canals are intact. Their, technology supersedes things. You need to take that into account. But I couldn't say, well, the colony isn't significant because they paved the roads, because they were not paved before. So that doesn't make sense to me. So I'm saying that it does meet criteria because of these more muscular reasons. So we had the best drone photography ever.
Yes, we'll have a lot of aerial photography of this area. We took over I want to say almost 2,500 pictures of this. Let's just say we very well documented this colony. So yes, we have a lot of amazing aerial drone photography that kind of shows you this living landscape, as Vonn likes to call it. So like, again, as we're talking about, landscapes obviously evolve, they change, like you say, they're dynamic. They, you know, even though this particular colony is actually still functioning as it did over 137 years ago when it was, you know, originally platted out, it is actually still functioning. A lot of these elements are still intact, they're still extant, and they're still functioning as they were originally intended.
This is the best quote if you ever need to make an argument about cultural landscapes and those nasty changes.
Yeah.
Use this quote. It's brilliant. Whoever wrote that quote, maybe Melnick, I don't know, but it tells you these are changing separate systems, living in dynamic constructs. And you know, now when we first went up there, I think it was the second time I went up with you, we noticed they were taking down walnut trees.
Yeah.
Almonds are coming in like crazy. The vineyards are almost, you know, I can see the vineyards being gone.
Yeah, pretty soon.
Very soon.
Yeah.
And that's because China now is growing grapes for raisins.
Yeah.
Well, there's probably other excuses, but there's probably more money in almonds.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's still an ag colony. It's still a colony. Its boundaries have been subsumed, but it's still amazingly, from 1878, amazingly intact.
And then, of course, from that Guide to Cultural Landscapes, you get the different components of a cultural landscape. This is just kind of the breakdown of what those different components are that you do take into consideration when you are evaluating a cultural landscape. We utilize these components, obviously, of a cultural landscape to assess the existing conditions of the Washington irrigated colony, looking at the natural systems, looking at the spatial organization, circulation, all these things, to really understand the area as a whole, as an entire landscape, not just, as Vonn said, you know, we went up there initially looking to evaluate architecture, but realized, especially when you look at this aerial photo, where very little architecture compared to this vast landscape, but that landscape has a very strong relationship to those architectural features. But that is just that one point, that one, like you see on this list, buildings and structures are just one component of a cultural landscape. And so that was something that we definitely had to take into consideration when we went back out there in later trips.
And I like to always say that architecture is a component of the landscape. Yes. Architects get crazy.
They get, yeah, they do. we do, I should say.
Yes.
So some existing conditions of the colony, obviously with the natural systems and features. The 1923 USGS quadrangle map shows you these lowlands. All of these blue areas are the tule ponds. Tule ponds were a big thing all throughout the Central Valley, and especially in this area. They used it a lot within, you know, their architecture and that sort of thing. But of course, those are no longer extant. However, I mean, you can still see where the location, the orientation of these prominent low-lying lands, how they fed into the bigger systems, how the Kings River then comes in and they use that for the eventual digging of those open earthen canals. Again, here's that plat map from the original, so you can kind of see the spatial organization. The road grid, obviously a very distinct grid, north, south, east, west, very much on those cardinal directions. It's a little bit harder to see, but if you look in there, you can see the lighter lines that kind of crisscross through there. Those are actually those irrigation canal systems. You've got the regular parceling. They're mostly 20-acre parcels, as we discussed earlier. You could buy 20 acres. You could buy multiple parcels and have yourself a larger crop that year.
And many people did.
many people did. We have the plat maps for many years to kind of take a look at who owned what. We did a lot of research into the people as well. But as you can see around the town of Covell / Easton, those are all 10-acre parcels. And then along that middle road, it's called Lincoln Avenue, they did also another row of 10-acre parcels to kind of give it you that grand entrance into the town. One thing that is very interesting, and again, goes back to that business model that they were kind of trying to develop, is those 10-acre parcels. If you purchased a 20-acre parcel out in the whole of the colony, you actually got a 10-acre parcel in town. You actually got a parcel, a town parcel, because they wanted, this was kind of progressive for them back then. They wanted to have you live in town and then go out to your farm. So when the initial selling of these parcels, initially back in 1878, 1879, and a few years later, they were actually, every 20-acre parcel had an associated town parcel, so that they could try and build up that town, so kind of keep business in that area, and then you would go out to your farmland. Obviously, farmers don't do that.
Didn't work.
Did not work. So obviously, in later years, the parcels were selling like hotcakes. Basically, they sold all of the farmland. The town parcel, association didn't quite last, but the town of Covell still thrived and developed. As far as land use, again, we're talking about components of a cultural landscape. Obviously, land use in an agricultural area is a big deal. This is actually a map from Karen White's report that we just updated a little bit, but it's actually very similar to what she recorded and what we have now. So not much change in these 20 plus years. Mostly vineyards. They are, like we said, they're kind of shifting into nuts at this point. Almonds, walnuts, pistachios. They're kind of shifting into different crops. But as again we say, it's still an agricultural colony.
It's always been specialty crops. California is not the big wheat growing or the big corn growing like the Midwest. We've always been specialty crops.
Right. So again, we have, the vineyards, the orchards. Another thing that was interesting about the colony is that throughout this area, they were planting eucalyptus groves. They needed that supply of hardwood. They needed that supply. So there are a couple of groves left. You can still see.
They needed shade.
Well, that too. Yeah. When you look at this area, when you go out there now, nothing, no shade, no trees. It's very hot in the summer. So yeah, they definitely needed it for the shade. They needed it for the wood supply. So there is still evidence of these eucalyptus groves around. There is a picture of it later. We'll see. Circulation, as we talked about before, the road grids. This is actually a current map of Easton. You can still see that grid, although some of the roads didn't quite get finished, or as you can see kind of large in the center there, that's the Easton High School. So that kind of, took out that road grid area there, but you can still see that initial grid pattern originally platted out by the founders of the colony. So roadways, the canals, all the circulation is still there.
And on the right, that's the road that was analyzed.
Right. Highway 41 was the reason for Karen White's report back in the 90s.
Right. And then well east is the old easement, the rail easement that the HSR is building off of. It's already an extant easement out there. They're making it a little bit wider, and that's really we'll talk about the technicality of more concentration on the alignment.
Yes.
Later.
Yeah. And then, of course, vegetation is a huge part of this cultural landscape because it is an agricultural landscape. Obviously, there's a lot of mature tree plantings, orchards, eucalyptus groves, as I discussed.
For domestic use, or for sale, some.
Yeah.
But everybody they adorned their properties, which was California can grow anything, and people from upper latitudes and not from the United States were thrilled that they could grow almost anything, and they did.
Yes. And then, of course, the reason we went up there initially was for the buildings and structures. But as you can see, this is only one small component of this entire landscape. There's so many other things that are still intact and still functioning in this cultural landscape. But as far as buildings and structures, obviously with our period of significance being 1878 to 1922, we evaluated everything in the colony. The colony consists of 384 parcels. So going through finding these relevant buildings and structures that applied, to our period of significance, obviously you found a lot of buildings and structures that are newer. But what was interesting is that we noticed that in the newer structures, they were put in the exact place of the original farmstead. So, I mean, their relationship to the agriculture, to the landscape, still was there. Even though the building itself was no longer a contributing part of the landscape, its location within the landscape remained. So that was another interesting thing.
This is a tank house. This was the water. I mean, this was the first colony that bragged and even included the word irrigated. I mean, they were on a megaphone, like, look at us, we are irrigated.
Yes.
That was huge, and that's why the one before it failed. And it launched once everyone figured out that they could irrigate. If we show you a map of Central Valley from the first one that we showed you with the 2 colonies, it just went, and it was like gold. It was another, finding gold era.
Right.
And but this building is so dear. These tank houses are just, and if you would go back maybe early 20th century, pre-war, early 20th century, they would be everywhere. And this is, this one's original. So
yes,
they're very dear. They're very.
So at the end of the day, which we're not quite finished yet, it's been a 2-year project. We're not quite done, but we're so close. But as of right now, we do have 134 documented structures, each individually on a DPR for the state. SHPO will be taking a look at every single thing that we're doing. So of course it's going to include the farmsteads, the vernacular buildings, these tank houses, of course, and then the barns, which I'll talk a little bit more about those character defining features throughout the colony as we get to them on the architectural side of things.
Yes.
But of course, water features are a major part of this irrigated colony. It is called the Washington Irrigated Colony. So those main water features are, of course, these open furrow earthen canals. We were lucky enough to go at so many different times in the year that we actually were able to see them with water in them, because there are parts of the year where they actually are dry. And that's a rough time for the residents of the colony. So it was very interesting to be able to see them, how they were maintained, because there are maintenance requirements for these open earthen canals. They are still utilized the way they were historically, relatively minor damage, constant maintenance, and like Vonn said, there are areas where it was piped and put underground for repaving of roads and stuff like that. But looking at it in its entirety, the amount of miles of open furrow canals really contribute to its significance as a cultural landscape, because they're so much intact with only a little bit of change coming from, modern technologies.
Water was the lifeblood of this colony. So it's very important.
And of course, these are all fed by the Kings River to the east.
And the Fresno Water District.
And the Fresno Water District. Now. Of course, views and vistas. Again, I love you looking at these aerial photographs. They really show you the difference in what they're planting, how they're planting, just an overall view of what this area looks like. You can see there's some almond trees in there. They look so fluffy and nice. But then you've got the vineyards. You've got, you've got a real, broad view from this angle. But of course, as you're driving through, it's not quite what you see. It's very flat, so you're not going to see a lot of what you're looking at. But again, we utilize the drone photography to really capture those aerial views of the landscape. But like I said, traveling along these geometric roadways, it really created kind of a confined feeling. It's flat topography, so it really inhibits the views beyond, the block that you're situated in. So you could be standing at the road looking at this house, but you can't see anything beyond it because of this extremely flat. You can tell from this aerial shot how incredibly flat the Central Valley is. So then moving into actual, evaluation. Okay, so obviously we were utilizing the National Register of Historic Places criteria, significance criteria, A through D, how we were going to evaluate the colony using these. Like we said before, it was previously evaluated by Karen Weitz. She felt that there were significance arguments to be made for all 4 criteria. So we took into consideration what she had already provided, and then with our expansion of the period of significance, and the context that we were putting this colony in, because there are a number of themes that you see throughout the period of significance for this this area. So we took those things into consideration, and then of course existing conditions to kind of figure out where is the significance, what is it that we can argue for. Of course, also we had to evaluate integrity using the 7 aspects, as you can see here. This is one of my favorite photographs, is one of the buildings. It's my favorite way to kind of depict the difference between condition and integrity, because a lot of people get confused on that. This house happens to have immaculate integrity as far as those 7 aspects go. It's all there, not in the best shape. It is kind of, falling apart, but I love that little part of the chimney up there that's just all the little bricks are just hanging on as hard as they can. But integrity is intact for this structure. So, I mean, and again, applying these things, we're going to talk about it in a second, but applying these things to a landscape, obviously these aspects are very easy to apply to a single structure. Location, design, setting, materials. Yeah, materials, workmanship, those are things you can definitely pinpoint on a building. It's much harder to do that on a landscape. So
in the historical context, we found that as the decades went on, the first structures were very Spartan,
yes,
to say the least. And then a few decades later, they did a little bit better, and then pretty soon we're going toward kind of a Queen Anne here. Right, so
Queen Anne,
you know that they were suffering with success.
Right.
So that was an interesting thing to watch as well, and that hadn't occurred until we really figured out that morphology of the people settling and really permanent.
Yeah. So again, combining the significance and integrity for the colony, okay? The colony does, in our opinion, and as we, as we took the time to review Karen's work and look at what we had extant and just all of the different historic contexts we were using, we decided that it was really A through C that could really hold criteria as far as a great argument for significance. Under A, of course, it has remained in continuous agricultural use, operated by small, independent family farmsteads as originally intended, utilizing the methods of cultivation, crops, and the canal irrigation systems for over 137 years. So, I mean, that consistent use as a secular agricultural colony still today. I mean, it's still in that same use. Definitely
broad spectrum of pattern.
Definitely a broad pattern of history here. Yes. Side note, this image does show you one of those eucalyptus groves right there in the middle, in case you were wondering. And then, of course, under criterion B, I mean, we were kind of struggling with this because, like we said, A.T. Covell and Wendell Easton, they were the founders. They really designed it.
The mappers.
They mapped it out. They created the business, but then they left. They kind of got the ball rolling and then went back to San Francisco. So we were kind of struggling with how do we make the argument that they are significant, but to take into consideration that the business model that they, started, that they advertised, that they set up, fulfilled, has been in continuous use this many years later. It was one of those things that we decided, they definitely had a major impact on the creation and perpetuity of this canal, or of this colony.
When you're doing significance, we had about 8 or 10 names in there first.
Right.
Okay, but that guy was just over here.
Yeah.
These are the founders. I mean,
Right.
nothing would be here without these two guys.
Yeah.
I mean, we were in the same table having the same discussion,
Right.
going, you know, everybody's throwing out names. And I said, okay, no, wait, these guys filed the map with the county. And Covell actually was in residence for some time, as was Easton for a little bit. Easton kind of made the second half.
Right.
And there's a Covell Park in Fresno. I mean, when you're evaluating something on the run, you don't have time to find out that Covell did all these other things and went to Stockton and did more. He was a farm setup kind of guy. And Easton was pure railroad, you know, pure business. So the bios on these two guys, we found a little bit, but you could really just go further. If you were doing a National Register nomination, you would have to go further. And I'm sure you would find much. I found that Easton was down in San Diego County here, and really setting up farming, you know. So they were opportunists, but they knew what they were doing, and they did it well. These guys raised the bar at the beginning. I mean, if they hadn't come along, I feel it would have been really kind of sad.
Yeah. Might have fallen flat like the rest of them. The surrounding colonies.
Absolutely. Oh, it's interesting that they started with muscat raisins, and muscat, Old World, they bring it here, does great for a while, and then it does not like alkali soil. They were overwatering, they were wasting water. When you water plants, you have to know their seasonal patterns, you know, through ancient times, and they were just flooding all the time. So they lost the muscat, and they went on to another Old World species that a man named Thompson went to some agriculture fair back in New England and saw this great grape and, you know, patented it. And it became the Thompson. It was from Persia, but it now is the Thompson grape. So finding all those little lines of interest was just, you know, you got to know when to stop.
Right.
And write the report.
Yeah.
But it was fascinating, absolutely fascinating.
Right. And then continuing on, obviously, Criterion C is definitely an architectural piece of significance there. So, of course, you know, the extant buildings and structures, 134 individual DPRs for that. So, I mean, the colony maintained a large number of extant buildings, distinctive characteristics of architecture of folk Victorian, Queen Anne, vernacular, free classical, and craftsman, all within our period of significance. So we found excellent ways to kind of argue that significance under Criterion C. And of course, in our opinion, the colony does retain the integrity of all 7 aspects, however you can apply it, whether it is to the buildings and structures or to the cultural landscape as a whole. So like we keep saying, because it is an important thing and an interesting thing that we've run into is that, you know, the criteria from the National Register are really, you know, they're easily applicable to architecture, but much more difficult in applying these criteria to landscapes. You know, they're really not meant for the landscape as a whole, as we said, you know, materials, workmanship, you know, how do you argue significance and integrity of workmanship of a landscape? You know, that does make it very difficult. But we determined that, you know, the character defining features of this landscape really help aid in determining that significance and integrity. So here are just a few character defining features of this cultural landscape. So of course, you know, the farmhouse outbuildings, you know, the vineyards, the shade trees, because something we did notice as we started really driving through this area and looking at and seeing, you'll notice that a lot of the farmhouses planted tall shade trees on that side, the south side of their building, so that they could actually have some shade, because it was hot and sunny, and as you can see, again, flat, very flat. So, I mean, all of these things combine to make this farmstead, you know, landscape really was something that we could look at and determine, is there significance? Does it retain its integrity? So looking at some of those things.
The farmstead would include that domestic landscape within that vernacular ag landscape.
Right.
And that was repeated and repeated and repeated.
And now this is an example of the barns that we saw throughout the colonies. The transverse crib barn. It's the most common style of barn you see in the Washington irrigated colony, but what makes it interesting is that it's not indicative of the cultural traditions of those who settled in the colony. So like we said, they really went over to Scandinavia and Germany and all those areas and brought people in. So you think you would see more, you know, barns or different kinds of structures that would reflect Swedish or Norwegian or, you know, German architecture, but Covell and Easton kind of set it up to be like, hey, we've got it all laid out, just come farm and live, you know. So you don't actually see those cultural influences on the architecture in the area, which is really interesting. And you don't think, you know, that Scandinavians could come over and learn to grow grapes, but they did, and they did it successfully. Again, I mean, one of the things that we did notice that are still extant in limited supply, but you do still see them around, are these personal citrus orchards, or personal orchards of any kind. They would definitely, you see throughout the period of significance that they would plant these orchards for their own personal use, close in proximity to their house, so that they could have something beyond just their crop to sell. So finding some of these extant personal orchards was really kind of an exciting thing, and a great, you know, aerial shot to really show the relationship between those personal orchards to their croplands. Again, I think Vonn will want to chime in on this one, but we see throughout the colony that palms were used to really demarcate where you entered somebody's farmstead.
This was a framing of your entry toward this piece of architecture, which is missing in this picture. But these are native California fan palms, Washingtonia foliifera. This is interesting because in the north and in the Central Valley, they use California palms, not Mexican fan palms like we use in SoCal. We have a lot of Mexican fan palms. This is the cousin. This is the one that is native to Anza Borrego Desert. And we found these. There was one property where it was bundled, I don't know how many acres, that had all their roadways just lined with these. We have a picture of that coming up. Yeah. But these are all centenarians. They're all over 100 easily. And they're still framing, they're still standing there framing, you know, but they knew they could grow anything. I have to mention a name, William Kearney, who owned a vast property in Fresno. If you ever go to Fresno, Kearney Park is there, and it's the most amazing collection of over 100-year-old trees. And he was instrumental in helping farmers and helping import exotics, which now we have a different ethic, but in those days it was a cool thing. But I mean, trees that I've never seen that mature, that I didn't know got that mature. It's an amazing park. And he played a role when Berkeley started the Tulare experimental station to help the farmers with their alkali soil and the change in grapes. At some point, the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, took over and shunned what the Tulare station was doing. And after Dr. Hilgard retired, they shut it down. And the USDA said, we don't work for clients, meaning the farmers. And that was not Hilgard's reason why he ever established that experimental station. Really kind of a nasty little thing between the feds and the state. But so what Kearney did is he left his huge property to the University of California for experimental reasons. So he got the last laugh.
Right. And then one major feature that we love.
I drove her to every important feature.
Yes.
This girl learned so much on this
yes, so many
project.
Things.
She is now a cultural landscape historian.
Right.
This isn't a cork tree. When they first started thinking about mass vineyards, they were really thinking of wine. When you go to Portugal, you'll see vineyards lined by cork trees. This is the European oak. It's called Curcasuber. And you just peel off the cambium layer, and that's your cork. You can only do that maybe every 5 years or so, or maybe even more, depending. But this guy is the oldest tree at the colony, and it was when they were transforming into another need, so there wasn't many needed after that. But anytime you see a cork oak, if you just peel a little bit off, it's cork. So I call it a witness tree because it was there the longest and it witnessed a lot of interesting stuff. So yes. The National Park Service has a witness tree program. They're doing battlefield witness tree documentation, trees that were extant during the Civil War and such. And I briefly worked on the Jack London State Park before Governor Schwarzenegger closed down all contracts that year. And the witness tree, the oak there, predated everything. I mean, that was one of the biggest oaks I've ever seen. And I kept saying, this is our witness tree. This is our witness tree. So that oak still better be there. And because it's from the Native American era. So think about witness trees. Think about these exports, but I mean, these imports, but know that these are very significant artifacts of that era, and nominate a witness tree.
So again, you know, luckily we've been working on this for nearly 2 years. We've been working on this project. We've been researching, documenting this cultural landscape in the Central Valley for a while now. We've become very familiar with this large scale landscape, how it fits into the context of California, of the country, of agriculture, of raisins, of all of these different elements that kind of create that cultural landscape. Again, we updated the district DPR. We authored more than 134 individual ones. We've received SHPO concurrence, a lot of this stuff. And construction has begun. I mean, they have commenced with the construction of the high-speed rail, so it will alter this landscape a bit. And especially if you talk to those, like we said, those residents in the colony, it will change this landscape. So we were fortunate enough to go out there and really spend a lot of time to make sure that we really understand what its significance is and how it has affected California agriculture.
This is where it began. This is huge. But we noticed changes even before HSR. You know, you have to go with the flow, what the market will bear, and all those other capitalistic terms. They see that raisins are not viable. Napa Sonoma has a lock on wine, so they're doing what they need to do. But this is California ag 37 years, you said?
Yeah.
100, she counts faster than I do. 137 years later, it's still happening. It's still in process.
Yeah,
so
still that dynamic cultural landscape. So that's kind of it for us. I'm going to look here to see if y'all have questions or something that we can answer for you. And yeah, just let us know if you have any questions that we'd be happy to answer as far as this goes, or cultural landscapes as a whole.
This is a fascinating presentation. Thank you both. I'll note that the two of you work very well together when you're presenting.
I was going to interrupt her even more, but I chose not to.
You held back.
I did.
There were quite a few questions. Did you want to field them, Katie, or would you like me to?
You can, and we can just answer them as we go.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first question was from. Okay, there were a few questions that were really about kind of putting it in the context of location, and people wanted to see a map, and then you guys showed a map. So if anybody missed that, it was, towards the beginning of the presentation, and I sent you the PDFs of the slides.
Right.
The second question was about the sort of the period of significance for this, and I think you may have briefly gone over it. I may have missed it, but what's the general time period that we're looking at for this district?
The period was, the founding was the first map was filed 1878 by Covell. The second map amended in 1879, the very next year, because this was going so fast, by Easton. So a total of 7,000 acres. So 1878 is the start date. I ended it at 1922 because that's when the Fresno Water District took control over the water of the Washington irrigated colony. That meant that was transformational. No longer could you buy land with water rights. All of California has water districts now. So.
Okay, that's good. That's a good answer. So the next one was Doug was asking if you evaluated the impacts of the HSR project on the cultural landscape, and if so, can you speak a little bit to that?
It's linear. It's not wholesale. It's linear.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. The high-speed rail is obviously a very large project. They are actually, thankfully, building this high-speed rail in line, actually only about 25 feet away from the original Santa Fe railroad that went through. It's actually on the east side of the colony. It was, that original railroad was put in 1898, so it's obviously a very old railroad. They're putting it in line with that, thankfully. So the effects of a railroad to the colony did not drastically change, but something that we did end up having to evaluate is obviously the effects of the APE on the surrounding buildings and structures. While a lot of that APE, the area of potential effect, is on agricultural land. So, you know, as we've talked about, agriculture does change. It's ephemeral. It's dynamic. It changes over time. They're cutting that line right through where a railroad already existed. But we did also have to kind of evaluate and take into consideration how it's affecting the significant buildings and structures along that APE. We did end up going out there with structural engineers, noise and vibration engineers, to kind of evaluate the effects of, you know, yes, it's a railroad, but it's also a high-speed rail. These trains are going to be going upwards of 200 miles an hour, so that does definitely change a little bit the effect of a railroad on these agricultural properties. So it was more that sort of evaluation over how the railroad itself is affecting the broader cultural landscape, because, as we said, it's going in line with an existing railroad.
Just within our knowledge of what limited knowledge we're given about the HSR.
Right.
For so many years it was controversial, and everybody says we can't afford this. It's, you know, on and on, the whole libertarian argument. Mm-hmm. And so now the argument is from the South going, how come the North gets it first?
Right. It's a lot harder to go through LA than it is to go through agricultural land in Fresno.
They don't have the alignment nailed for the South, because it's, you know, a
little bit different of a cultural landscape.
Real estate.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Well, thanks for that answer. We had a few more pop in.
Okay.
So I will start with a comment that was made on one of your last slides about the cork oaks, and Wendy wanted to mention that in Napa, clustered around a former Kirkbride asylum, there are about a dozen witness cork oaks.
And wonderful.
Yeah, cool. I sort of responded to that, and I recall my days hiking in the backwoods of Oregon and finding old mining orchards and market gardens in the middle of nowhere with no structure present. So I noted that, you know, very often the vegetation and the trees outlive the built environment, the structure.
If they could speak.
Right.
Right.
They'd have stories to tell.
Yes.
And there's a question from Wendy that sort of followed that, and she asked what portions maybe last with construction and what other cultural landscapes will be impacted. I'm not sure if I entirely get that question. Do you think you understand what she means by that?
Not really.
Last with construction. As far as our, assignment for what we were evaluating, our section was actually pretty far. It was about a 64-mile section that we were evaluating. This was the cultural landscape that was, intact. It had, boundaries. It was, I mean, obviously the whole Central Valley is another broad landscape that we didn't go specifically into as far as its effect, the railroad's effect on it. We focused on this obviously very significant, historically significant cultural landscape. There are still things, outside of this that were taken into consideration, cemeteries and other elements throughout that alignment. But this one cultural landscape is what we kind of focused in our evaluation and assessment on.
I believe that when Karen did her work in the early 90s, that was for the highway going through.
41, yeah.
And had she not done such amazing work and had it deemed eligible, I'm kind of wondering if we would have even been considered to do this.
Yeah.
And since she was really architectural centric on that,
yeah.
It was better to do an expansive look at and discover that this is where California ag and the water wars began,
right? Which
is huge in California history.
Yeah. And another interesting thing about Karen White's report done, she originally authored it in 1991. It was around that time that cultural landscapes were actually becoming a thing. It was just becoming something important. So she actually had to write kind of like
an
addendum to her own report saying, yes, this is a cultural landscape. This is a big thing coming into the historic preservation world. And that she recognized that this is a cultural landscape, even though it was a brand new thing just beginning. So we were so fortunate to have her study, very in-depth study. She was that farsighted. Yeah.
Okay, so this is a very vibrant question and answer period. There looks like we have 5 to cover here. So Doug is also asking, what about agricultural fields as character-defining features? Their continued use and existence seems an important component of integrity and significance.
Absolutely.
Well, we were on the run doing this. I can tell you that the way they staked grapes in the late 19th century is radically different from how they stake them now. Again, as technology takes over, there's different methodologies in ag. So I don't know if you want to take off from there.
Well, but yeah, just as we kind of discussed a little earlier, the land use. I mean, the amount of acreage of farm land, grapes, almonds, pistachios, walnuts. I mean, those agricultural fields, even the fallow, I mean, all of it is part of this cultural landscape as a whole. We definitely took those into consideration because it is, I mean, again, this is a 7,040 acre colony. I mean, it's a large piece of land that is mostly agricultural fields. So those are definitely a character defining feature of this colony, and it was definitely taken into consideration and evaluated for significance and integrity. As we keep saying, you know, with ag land, it's ephemeral, it changes, but the overall using it as agricultural land has not changed. They haven't gone in and created a suburb of Fresno here. It is still a farming community.
Although that's probably the future.
Yeah.
You know,
it is changing.
Fresno during the 80s was the fastest growing city in California. Yeah. So I think it's probably inevitable that this will become suburbia, you know, but I think it's great that we got to document it and do a context before that.
Yeah.
So but our charge was to find impacts within the APE area.
Yeah.
The context was how helped us evaluate and put everything into categories. Mm-hmm. Did that answer the question?
It appears so. If not, you could probably follow up with a follow-up question. Another question, what kind of management plan will arise from this? As clients and resource managers, we are most concerned with how to actually manage these landscapes while allowing for continued use or specific projects. There's a second question, but you can start with that one.
These are all independent, privately owned farms.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a coalition. We actually met some people while we were dining in one of the one of their fine establishments. Who knew a lot of history. He was wonderful. But you know, I'm sure they have their own, you know, HOA, as it were. Right. So it's not a regulated public landscape. So.
Then the second question was, what kind of impacts have you identified as part of the high-speed rail project, and or what are you suggesting for mitigation? And I guess you already answered the management part, but what are you suggesting for mitigation?
We did create, again, with the help of structural and noise and vibration engineers, we did create protection and stabilization plans for some of the resources that will be most impacted by the rail itself. Obviously, those in closest proximity to the alignment. But as we said before, it is along the same alignment as a historic, you know, easement and railroad that's been functioning. I mean, it's currently the BNSF railroad, Burlington, yeah. Going through there. I mean, we were, like I said, we were out there so much. We were, you know, trains every 15 minutes or so. So I mean, it's really the landscape as far as its impacts from the railroad isn't going to change much in terms of how the railroad will affect these structures, because they've been experiencing it for 100 years.
When the railroad went in 1890, when Santa Fe came in and rescued this colony, because the Central Pacific was getting so ornery about pricing and about access. I mean, they were driving these farms to their knees, and the Santa Fe came to their rescue. It really started out as the People's Railroad, and it kind of got into a conglomeration, and then it manifested into the Santa Fe, which was coming up from the Southwest. Santa Fe settled the Southwest, really. And they came up through the Central Valley and really liberated these farms. So that easement has a great history, and it was a separate railroad. It was not on the old Central Pacific alignment, and so it has its own history.
Interesting. All right. Well, I think that answers that. So I'm going to mark that as done. Ellen from San Francisco is asking, did you find any archaeological or paleontological DPR records in the landscape? Any Columbian mammoth bones or anything like that?
That was not part of our purview, but we did work alongside an environmental firm who did and has been and is still doing a lot of the survey work for archaeo and paleo stuff out there. Well, an interesting kind of little anecdote with that, because like I said, that wasn't really our purview. We were more the cultural landscape and the architecture side of it, the built environment. But in our oral interviews, because I did go out there and I did speak to a number of residents, including one who was one of the original residents of this. She was the daughter of an original resident from, she was 93. She was wonderful. I loved her. But gave us some really interesting information about like growing up there and having this, you know, amazing experience as a child. But one thing that came up was that there could have potentially been a cemetery, not an official one, but a burial ground of railroad workers from when they were constructing the original railroad. So of course we then had to notify our environmental firm partners that, hey, there might be something to find out there while you're out there, just a heads up. So I mean, that was something like that. I mean, those were kind of the things we were running into. Obviously, there was a lot of Native American activity in this area prior to, obviously, the colony.
Further south, there were tribes around Tulare. I mean, the big Tulare Lake that's no longer there.
Right.
That was where a lot of, well, before Rancherias, but they were there.
But yeah, so we were fortunate enough to work alongside an environmental firm who kind of took care of all of that. But of course, that's always the really interesting stuff to find when you dig some of that stuff up. So
excellent. We're only one question away from at least all the ones that have been asked. Oh,
from lunch.
Now that we're two open. One just bounced in. So first of the two is, did you find any oh wait, I already answered that one.
Yeah, that's the same question.
I already marked that one.
Yeah, we got that. For Vonn.
This question is for Vonn. As a landscape person, at what point is damage or removal of plants a loss of integrity? And then there's a second question, but you can start with that.
Well, some of these centenarians, they're still in good health. But as it is a dynamic cycle, and believe me, I have tried to find studies on the longevity of exotics introduced into our area from the southern hemisphere, from different continents, and there is none. And that would be a great thesis for somebody to do, or a dissertation for somebody to do, because we really don't know. These palms that we're looking at now, they're well over 100. I don't know how old the palms are in Anza Borrego. And, you don't count rings on a palm. And, these older, great pieces of artifact of vegetation are critical. And I mean, when I first went up to, this is what I saw, was that line of California fan palms. And it was just striking that they were making this statement with these. But I guess I'm kind of not answering the question really. We have so many exotics in California, first being the eucalyptus that came in during the gold rush, that we really don't know how long these are going to last. And if you could be more specific on that question, because I'm not really sure I'm answering it well.
Well, maybe the second part sort of clarifies a bit. And the second part was, when do you think would tampering with that line of palm trees be an adverse effect on the resource?
I think it would be a profound effect. I mean, that's a visual right there. But in cultural landscapes, it's kind of like in architecture. You can replace in kind. I worked on the Mills College in Oakland, the first women's college on the West Coast, funded by the Getty. And there was an alley of eucalyptus that was planted by Cyrus Mills himself in 1860s. And they were the raucous Tasmanian Eucalyptus globulus, which was planted all over California, the first one. Berkeley had a huge plantation. Jack London had a plantation, on and on. The city of Oakland would reduce your property taxes if you grew eucalyptus. Teddy Roosevelt declared through his chief forester, Gifford Pinchot, a hardwood famine in America, and the eucalyptus was going to solve that. So it became a mania to plant eucalyptus. They issued government bulletins on how to do it. They would provide the seed, on and on. That didn't work out, but here we're left with all these eucalyptus all over California. But at Mills College, it came to the point where these eucs were 150 years old and they're 150 feet tall, and they had grown together at the bottom. I mean, all of their trunks had melded because he had planted them so close together, and the college wanted to take them down. And I'm wait, no. Their press is called Eucalyptus Press. I had a picture of the women walking through that LA from every decade of the school's history. It went up to the railway that went into Oakland. So I said, okay, what the death knell is that a branch fell off and hit one of the trustees' cars. So it was going.
Yeah.
So they said, well, we should plant oak trees. And I went, well, okay, no, the characteristic is vertical.
Yeah.
The characteristic is that sickle leaf, that blue leaf. The characteristic is uke. So I did it took a long time and a lot of angry discussion, but we talked in doing not the Tasmanian, but the Sydney Eucalyptus globulus, which it behaves a little better and doesn't get so monstrously huge. And they planted them, and you have to go there and see them because they are now very tall and they're very beautiful. We planted them 15 feet apart, but we replanted in kind. And this was developed by the Presidio in San Francisco because they had globulus. James Irvine planted globulus all over all over Orange County. Was key. That species was that subspecies was the key. So replanting in kind. If this had to come down, it's not in the path of the HSR, and these will eventually go by the wayside. If you've been to Sacramento to the hill, it's lined with California fan palms, and in fact, there's a tree from every county in the state of California on Capitol grounds. I mean, these are things that people respect. These are landmarks. These are living landmarks. So after going through the Mills College experience, it can be done, and apparently it had to be done. Sometimes you don't win your battles, because I would have loved to see how long they would last, but the campus had urbanized so much, it became so dense that they were dangerous. But I kind of talked that answered somebody's question.
I think that answered it, yeah. So I'm going to mark that as done.
Okay.
And I actually have been dying to ask my own questions because usually I wait, I wait for other people to ask their questions, and most often my questions are answered by somebody else. But the one question I had was about your use of drones, because you mentioned you had used drones.
Yes.
I don't know if I've seen this presentation twice now, and it gets better. I don't know if you have the photos of the drones in your last presentation or not, or if this is a new kind of development. But what I was curious is, I know drones are used a lot in evaluating vegetation, agriculture. You can use certain tools like infrared to evaluate the health of the vegetation. And I don't know if you've made use of that yet, or if you have any experiences that you'd like to talk about in that realm.
I don't. This was the first drone experience, and it really, I mean, they're being so limited now. Someone tried them in San Diego recently, someone told me, and they had it in a canyon in San Diego. San Diego is full of canyons, and all of a sudden it just dropped to the earth, and it was very close to the path of Lindbergh Field of San Diego International. And I think the Port Authority or the Airport Authority has the power to take it down remotely.
Wow.
Oddly enough, when Katie and Jojo were out there doing all of this filming, he set it up. They started early morning, set it all up, had their plan, started to fly, and it never came back.
Yeah, we actually we had fun little anecdote. Yeah, we were out there doing our drone photography. We were doing well, getting things done, and it is possible we got our drone hijacked. That actually happens. So somebody actually hacked into our drone system and took it. So
and it's
it flew away.
Because Jojo first called his insurance company.
Yeah,
then he called the sheriff.
Right, and we had to call the FAA. So I mean, drone photography is an amazing thing. It obviously as you can see from some of these images, it gives you a really great look at, especially a cultural landscape to this scale. I mean, it gives you some really great images and great documentation. But there are a lot of restrictions, a lot of things to take into consideration when you're doing drones. But it is super fun and fascinating, and we have thousands of aerial photographs of this landscape. So it's really great.
But John, we weren't there for the evaluation of health and more technical issues. We were there to really just do a
documentation
of extant fabric. So it would be interesting. I'm sure that's done all the time.
Well, yeah, I guess the reason I ask is because I know the state parks is in on this webinar, and they have to develop things like management plans from these kinds of surveys. So they might have they might find it interesting. I know they have their own initiative to document as many as they can using aerial photography and drones, and Bodie was one recent example that they completely did a 3-dimensional model using a drone of a lot of the structures out there. So, kind of an interesting tool that is becoming much more affordable, I think, for even non-consultants, you know, even advocates. So there was another question, but I wanted to ask one more before I get to this other one. And I saw that photo of the water tower, which was a really neat looking structure.
Isn't that great?
Yeah.
And the one thing I had a question about, and I don't know if you would know this, I mean, it's a long shot that you may or may not know this, but on the top of that water tower was a crescent moon symbol. Did you notice that?
Yes, yes. And what's funny is that was actually the only one that looked like that. It was just such a fun picture. That's one of my favorite examples of the water towers. Not all of them look like that. Some of them are very plain, simple, you know, functional. But that one, yeah, that one did have some of that little bit of ornament. It had the, you know, skirt on there. It had the crescent. So it was interesting though, because like we said, their cultural traditions didn't really influence, but obviously something did there. Somebody who lived there.
Seems like John might know the answer to that himself.
Well, I just know the story behind outhouses and why they had the crescent moon symbol on them, and it might be apocryphal or sort of like, you know, but they say that it's because it denoted the gender of the bathroom, because the moons were a female symbol, you know, Luna, and in, you know, I guess in colonial times the male symbol was either the sun or a star. So I guess that carried out from, but it could be just an urban legend. I don't know. I was just curious why they would apply a symbol to that, to a water tower, when it's usually something denoting an outhouse.
Right, exactly.
It could have doubled.
Well, yeah, and again, I mean, what's interesting about this colony is that even early on, you know, late 19th, early 20th century, a lot of these parcels were actually in the wives' names. That the men, I mean, they would put all of their property in their wives' names. So it was very interesting to see a lot of women owning a lot of these parcels. So you never know if that crescent moon might distinguish a female farmer.
Female owner.
Female owner. So
I just noticed that, and I wanted to know if either of you knew the story behind it, but sometimes it's pretty hard to find the stories behind small symbols in the environment. And okay, so the final question, looks like we're at 25 after, so if we have any further questions, we still have a little bit of time to answer them. But the final question that we have so far is, high-speed rail project is a huge north to south pass. I'm sorry if I missed, but how did you pick this relatively small section to evaluate along the whole pathway?
Yeah, that was because it had been evaluated 20 years before for a highway, impacts to the colony from the highway, and it was deemed eligible, so it was ripe to be reinvestigated, reevaluated. Right. But the first plan that Karen did was architecturally centric, and we expanded that to cultural landscape in an historic context, and so.
Yeah, and a little bit of background. Obviously, the high-speed rail project has been going on for a long time, and it's been segmented as far as how it's being evaluated and all that kind of stuff, how it's being documented. And so a lot of the research prior to our being hired onto this project, I mean, they've been doing, you know, historic architecture surveys for, I think they began in 2007, and I mean, so they've been evaluating and reevaluating where they want the alignment for a number of years now. And so as those things, as the alignment has been kind of nailed down here and there, and with previous study done on certain areas, there are different things throughout the alignment that could be looked at and that we have looked at. This was just one of those major elements of where the alignment is crossing, that did require some deeper evaluation, deeper research to kind of look at and see how this new construction project is going to affect a very significant, albeit yes, very small in terms of the overall alignment of the railroad. But yeah, having that previous research done and having previous reports to kind of work from is kind of how we were brought in to kind of focus on specific things that they wanted, that the state wanted evaluated. So
great.
Yeah.
So that is the final question. I'll leave it open just another 20 to 30 seconds in case anything else pops up. And while we're waiting for anything that anybody else wanted to ask, one, I wanted to thank our two speakers today, and also Katie for being on our education committee this year and helping organize programs. But second, I just wanted to remind people that the way we find out what to plan for the next year, which is actually happening right now because our year starts October 1st for education, is by collecting your responses and your suggestions for any future programs. And the way you can do that is by clicking on the survey link that's in the chat box. And I also emailed it to you while the presentation was going on. So please send us your responses on today's program and send us any suggestions on future programs. And our education committee will start pulling together programs starting October 1st. So this is one of the last programs of the year, and I'm glad that Vonn Marie and Katie were both here to present such an engaging hour and a half of interesting cultural landscape talk. So please continue to look at our website for future programs.